Okay, E. Barrett, Prettyman Jr. Welcome, and thanks a lot for last night.
My pleasure.
Just a lot of fun. Were you destined to be a lawyer since your father was a judge? Was that?
No, I was going to be a newspaper reporter. When I went directly from high school into World War II, private in the infantry. Got my feet frozen in Germany. Came back, went to Yale. Did virtually nothing for 4 years. Drank a lot of beer, played a lot of pool, chased a lot of women. As a lot of my fellow warriors did at that time, and then went to the Province Journal. I was going to be a newspaper reporter. And my problem there was I just absolutely loved it. It was wonderful work. You could not only do your assigned stuff, but you go out and do stories on your own, and it was a very imaginative job. But I was starving to death. I was eating spaghetti 3 times a day, and so I decided to go to 1-year law school and come back as this great constitutional expert and double my salary. And I went to Virginia, fully intending to go back, but I just fell in love with that and never looked back.
Did your dad encourage?
And it's interesting, my father was also a reporter before he became a lawyer.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, and I didn't consciously follow in his footsteps. I just, that's what I happened to want to do.
Give me a quick biography of your dad.
Well, he was born in Virginia, and he practiced law in a small town. We have a picture of him with a pistol on his belt. He was in World War I, but did not serve overseas. He came to Washington to work at the Internal Revenue, became general counsel, got fired by Roosevelt when he had a run-in with Morgenthau. I think it was over the gold standard. And they made him corporation counsel of the district. He then formed his own firm, Hughes, Prettyman, and Awalt, which practiced law. They practiced law. He did mainly tax law in the district, right across the street from where my office used to be. And then in 1945, Truman was newly in office, did not know my father, but was told by Tommy the Cork that he had to appoint someone local to the D.C. Circuit and someone who was respected and known. And he recommended my father, and so that's how that came about. And then he stayed on that court until his death.
And there's an E. Barrett Prettyman Federal Office Building.
Courthouse, yeah.
Courthouse, yeah. Mm. Is that a positive or a negative for E. Barrett Prettyman Jr.?
Oh, it's positive.
Yeah. Is that a big shadow?
I tell my partners I'm going up to my courthouse.
And then, going back to your biography, or autobiography, you go to law school, and then from there, graduate?
I graduated and went to clerk for Justice Jackson.
Tell me how that played out. You had known him before, or at least had acquaintances with him before.
My family knew him. I don't know whether I ran across him or not until law school. But I invited him down. I was on the legal forum. Bob Kennedy was then the head of the legal forum. He was 2 years ahead of me in law school. I invited him down, and he agreed to come. I think reluctantly. They were in the middle of a busy term, and he came down. I think what got me the clerkship was that when he got there early afternoon, and he was obviously tired and figured that we had things all lined up for him all into the evening and next day and so forth. And instead, I put him in his room and told him to go to sleep, and he got a good few hours sleep and felt totally rejuvenated. He thought that was just wonderful. He thought that was really great. And then we had cocktails and his talk and so forth. So I did have that one experience with him, but other than that, I really didn't remember him at all.
Was there an interview process for you?
Yes, I went up and interviewed with him.
Do you recall much of the interview at all?
I don't recall the details of it, but I remember it was wide-ranging. I had sent him my note from Law Review, which had won the prize, and we talked about that, labor law, but we talked about my parents, we talked about politics, we talked about just anything that occurred to us. It was almost like a cocktail reception conversation.
Did he mention at all why he wanted to go just to one clerk? It's okay.
He just said he was not going to have two clerks again.
Yeah. Okay. And then, so therefore, you were with him in the 1953 term, and then, of course, the few actually week or so of the 54 term, right? I have to always kind of.
It's toward the end of the 53 term that he asked me if I would stay over.
Okay. At that time, just maybe fast forward, did you get a sense of any, he had the heart attack, and he'd come back to the court during that summer of 54, did you get a sense that there was any really impending doom, health doom?
No, I wouldn't put it that way at all. He had slowed down a little bit. He was perhaps less robust, but I certainly didn't get any impression that he was doomed or in his last days or anything of that sort at all. He kept a pretty normal schedule. Maybe came in a little bit later, went home a little bit earlier, but no.
Right. Day one, did you have an opportunity to talk to any of the prior clerks as to the procedure?
I could be wrong on this. I'm not too clear, but I think there was about a week overlap where I did talk to both Don and Bill about things I was supposed to do and what Jackson liked and didn't like and so forth. That's my recollection. I don't remember the details of it.
As far as a clerk, what did Jackson like and what did Jackson dislike?
He liked somebody he could get along with, somebody who was simpatico with him, somebody who talked his language. I think he very much liked practical people, down-to-earth people. I don't think he was interested in great intellectuals who were in some kind of netherworld. And it was interesting comparing him to Harlan, because I never would have become Harlan's law clerk if it had not been that I was a leftover from Jackson and Frankfurter, because Harlan really didn't care about personality at all, I don't think. He simply took the best. I mean, somebody said, this guy was number one and head of the Law Review, I'll take him, you know. And so coming from Virginia and not being number one in my class, I probably could never have gotten that job on my own. But Jackson wasn't that way. You look at his clerks and they're kind of an eclectic group who all of them, for one reason or another, were very intelligent, don't misunderstand me, but he was just as interested in having somebody who got along with him, he can come in and chat with, as he was in the intellect, because after all, he, particularly by the time I got to him, he'd been on long enough so he knew it all, and he knew where he was going to go in most cases, and he knew how to write the opinions, and he didn't need that much help, although it was important, as I mentioned yesterday, that he still made little mistakes occasionally, and so it was important to have somebody who did know the basics of writing, even though he wrote brilliantly. And you did need to do some research. I think Don Cronson overstated a bit, at least for my time, as to what help he needed. I certainly did quite a bit of research. And he liked to talk some about the decisions too, even though he was not looking for help to make up his mind. He was looking more because he was interested in the case. I mean, you know, just like lawyers do.
Right. Was he receptive to advice from a young clerk?
Yeah.
In the sense of even that which was unsolicited?
Yes, to a point. He was not going to change his mind about how he was going to vote because I had something to say about it. But certainly in regard to his opinions, time and again, he would, if you look at the memo that I wrote in response to his unpublished opinion in Brown, you see that I could be very, very candid with him. We had that kind of relationship. So if I would suggest that a paragraph was really weak, it didn't seem to have any punch or didn't seem to make the point or made the wrong point or something like that, he almost always would change it in some fashion and make it better. That kind of thing. But I would not go so far as to say you're deciding this case for the petitioner for the wrong reason. You ought to drop your argument and adopt a counter argument or another argument or whatever. That wasn't in the cards.
Were other clerks, was there a sense that other clerks may have had a little more power of persuasion concerning the voting process of their bosses?
It was understood that some clerks not only had a greater power of persuasion, but they did a lot more of the work. They did more drafting. They had a lot to do with how the opinion was shaped, what grounds on, and so forth. I think that was true only in probably about 3, possibly 4 cases. Certainly one that I know of.
Right. And you're going to keep that name to yourself?
Yeah.
That's all I want to ask. The staffing of Justice Jackson at the time, Elsie Douglas, secretary. Was Mr. Parker there also?
Well, we were talking about that yesterday. I am ashamed to say that I can't remember the name of the gentleman who was there. Parker didn't strike a bell with me, but that could have...
older black guy who...
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry that I don't... You know, it was interesting that it was... You were really off by yourself. I mean, so I had that clerk's office all to myself, and I didn't see Elsie or the messenger that much. I mean, I saw him every day, of course, but I mean, we didn't spend lots of time together. I was working my tail off.
Yeah.
Had all those cert petitions and working on opinions too.
What was a normal day for you? What time did you get in?
I got in early. I got in almost always before the justice. It wasn't unusual at all for me to get in at least 8:30, something like that. And I sometimes worked well into the evening. It was wonderful work, and I enjoyed it. It was great. I didn't feel badly about it at all, but it was hard work. I mean, I knew where I was and what this opportunity was and what my obligations were, what my responsibility was. And I was going to do whatever it took to be a good clerk. I didn't care what it took. I worked weekends almost always.
Jackson's schedule, when would he come in?
He'd come in a little later, sometimes as late as 10 o'clock, and sometimes he'd work till supper time, but sometimes he'd go home early. He didn't seem to be under a great deal of pressure, but again, I have to emphasize, by the time I knew him, he had done it all. I mean, you know, he'd been there for a dozen years, and he knew the routine. He knew what it took. He wrote swiftly and naturally. So he didn't have to spend the hours that I did.
Did he work at home?
He did work some at home, and a few times I went to his home to work with him. He would call and say, "Why don't you come out here?" I'd go out to Hickory Hill, and we'd sit on the porch there in a round table and work away. It was very pleasant. That house holds such memories because I didn't go there when President Kennedy lived there, but I certainly went there many, many times when Bobby was living there, and I was there the night that Bobby was assassinated. The day he was assassinated, I was in, I think, Arizona, and I flew to L.A. Family asked me to go back to the house to be with the kids who'd been left behind. And I went back there, and there was a small group of us, including John Glenn, and finally Glenn said that he was going to go up and get a few hours sleep to wake him when Bobby died, because he was going to have to tell the children. And I went, I lay down in the little den there off the hallway in the front, and finally the Secret Service woke me and told me that Bobby died, and I had to go upstairs and wake up John Glenn and tell him so that he could tell the kids. So, I mean, I have memories stretching from those wonderful days in the sunlight working with Justice Jackson all the way over to Bobby's death.
Let's segue onto that. You had a close relationship with the Kennedys. Specifically, was Bobby because of the...
It was primarily with Bobby, and that started in law school, and then it went over when I was in practice. He called on me to take part in the getting back the Bay of Pigs prisoners, which ended up my going to Cuba and negotiating with Castro, going out to Hemingway's house and so forth. So I had a pretty close relationship with Bobby.
Let's talk about that. We're going to get off the subject here completely, because I just find it was the most amazing period of time. How did you even engage in the conversation with Castro? Was it a Castro conversation? Was it did you have emissaries that were working with as far as the return of some of the...
Well, what happened was the Kennedys really wanted to get those prisoners back because they felt very responsible for their being there. And they wanted to get them back by Christmas, and this was already early December. We only had, I don't know, maybe a week to go, something like that. And so a group of us, private attorneys, worked out of the Justice Department while Jim Donovan up in New York and John Nolan were actually dealing with Castro on the deal itself. We were getting a ship and planes and railroads and all the rest of it to get supplies into Florida where we could put it on the ship. And it was important that Kennedys be able to say this is not a government operation, because that would have upped the ante tremendously. This is a private endeavor. Well, of course, you know, it wasn't. I mean, we were all doing it right out of the Justice Department, but still. So I was in charge of transportation, of getting these planes and the boat and so forth, and then went to Florida, and we were loading this boat, and Castro got word that something was wrong. He was going to get a lot of junk and was going to be embarrassed. So he sent a couple of emissaries over, agents over in the middle of the night to see what was going on. And I only had about an hour's notice, so we repacked the ship and put all the good stuff on top. And they got there and looked things over, and then they went to a my room at the Howard Johnson's and called Castro and told him that it was okay. There was some junk, but they were telling us to leave it all behind. So they would go around the dock and say, take this, leave this, don't want this, want this, and so forth. And then flew back to Cuba. And of course, by the next morning, it was absolute chaos. Nobody knew what the hell was going and what was staying behind, and we had to get the ship out of there. And so I finally just said, load everything, we'll worry about it later. Mm-hmm. So we loaded everything on the ship, and I went to a phone booth and called Bobby, and I said, we have a little problem. I told him, in his typical fashion, he said, well, Barrett, I guess you just have to go down and explain to Fidel why he's getting all that junk. And the next thing I know, I'm on a plane for Cuba. Okay. So Castro came out the airport to meet me, and we had this conversation. I did not tell him. The ship was on its way. I figured I'd better wait for an opportune time. And just making conversation with one of his men, military men, I said, by the way, where's Hemingway's house from here? He said, well, it's up here in the hills. And he disappeared. He came back. He said, Fidel wants to take you. So we climb into these cars, Tommy guns all over the place, and off into the hills we go. And we get to Hemingway's house, and it's locked. The gate's locked. You can't get in. So they rush around the neighborhood trying to find somebody who's got a key, and Fidel is getting pretty upset. And they finally found a manservant of Hemingway's who'd been with him about 20 years and who had a key. And he not only let us in, but took us in and then showed us the whole house. And the house was just exactly the way Hemingway left it before he went. Half a bottle of booze and the weights on the wall in the bathroom and all this kind of stuff, slats under the bed. He showed us everything. And we stayed there for the afternoon, sitting around the kitchen where the TV set was, where Hemingway used to watch the fights. And Castro, now speaking English, extending his relationship with Hemingway. Turns out, I learned later, they only met once, but he made it sound as if they'd done quite a bit together. But in any event, finally, we got up and went down. We stopped once so some people could applaud Castro, and went down to the wharf, and the ship was there, and they had begun unloading. And the thing that they had unloaded was baby food, and it was to the sky. Incredible amount of baby. And Castro was ecstatic. And he ordered that the prisoners could start going out the next morning. And that's when I told him that he was also getting a lot of junk that he didn't want, and I tried to explain why, but he really wasn't interested at that point. I mean, he could see that he was getting the stuff that was going to be good. And he got a lot of pharmaceutical stuff and drugs and things. So I spent kind of a drunken night there at the Hilton, and next morning flew out with a plane load of prisoners, and really one of the most extraordinary events of my life, because those prisoners were absolutely silent sitting down there on the runway. And MiGs would land, so we couldn't take off, and the motor was going. It was one of those prop jobs, and motors were going, and we couldn't take off. We couldn't take off. It was dead silence. And then finally, we went down the runway, and as the wheels lifted off, it was absolute pandemonium. Wow. Cigars came out of nowhere. They were screaming and yelling and crying, and people were kissing me, hugging me. The whole trip back was amazing. Got back Christmas Eve, and the president had a Air Force plane fly us to Washington, and then he had a car. My then wife was in Baltimore with her parents, and so around 1 o'clock Christmas morning, And the president called the next day.
That's pretty remarkable. I can understand why that's a real highlight. And you had to feel awful good about the end result here.
Well, I do, and there was a follow-up to it some years later that I still can't quite put together. We had a receptionist in our firm who came to me and said that she wanted me to write to Castro. And I said, why? And she said she had some very dear friends who had a family, Cubans, who lived in Havana years before. And the family got out, except they could not take with them a grandmother who was taking care of a retarded child in the family. And now they had heard that the grandmother was ill, and they didn't know what was going to happen to this retarded person. Could I write to Castro and ask for him to release the grandmother and the child? And I said, well, first of all, I'm not even sure it's legal for me to write to him, but secondly, he's not going to know who I am. He's not going to pay attention to me. And he said, oh, no, please, would you at least try? So I called the State Department and said, is this okay to do it? And they said, sure, go ahead. They won't pay attention to it, but go ahead and write and just send us a copy for our file. So I wrote to him and I reminded him of our afternoon together. And of course, I never heard from him. But within a month, the police came and told the grandmother she'd have to leave everything behind, couldn't take anything with her, but put him on a plane.
Wow, good for you.
I mean, I don't know whether there was any connection or not, but it
Sure.
seemed circumstantial.
Yeah. What was he like?
Well, he was a very interesting fellow. I mean, the fact that he's outlived, what, how many presidents now, 7 or 8 or whatever, and still in power. He was a presence. He was not as scruffy as I had anticipated. He was tired. He was exhausted when I saw him. But he was very much an in-charge kind of guy. There were so many guns around that I was frankly thinking that he was not long for this world. It looked like somebody was going to knock him off. And of course, here he still is, how many years later, you know. He was intelligent. I would not say brilliant, but he was very intelligent. The language barrier, even though he spoke English, it was kind of a broken English, and therefore that's always a problem, and particularly when you're being interpreted before he was talking English, it's a problem to gauge somebody accurately. But I must say I was pretty impressed with him.
Robert Kennedy. I mean, you're really from classmates to, personal and a professional friend.
Well, we weren't classmates in the sense we were in school at the same time, but he was a couple of years ahead of me. He was graduating when he was in his 3rd year when I came into my 1st year. I liked Bobby a lot. I didn't always agree with him, but the thing I liked about him, I think most, well, 2 things. First of all, he was a natural leader. I never saw anybody who was able to energize really good people around him. He had some wonderful people around him who would have given up everything for him. And he could walk around the Justice Department and stop and ask somebody, some secretary, what she was doing or something. And man, it was like a movie star. She would want to work all day and all night, And the other thing that I really liked, it was fascinating, was his growth. His changes in him, the things that he learned, and you could almost, it was almost like watching a flower, fast-growing flower in front of you. I mean, you could see the changes from day to day. He, for example, had virtually no understanding of the problem with blacks, that is, the fact that they were being discriminated against and that they were having a hard time and so forth. when he learned that there were so few blacks in the Justice Department, it was an absolute bombshell to him. I mean, he couldn't believe it. But he did something about it right away. Each thing that he found out, and I went on a couple trips with him. I went to one trip to Mississippi and Alabama. When he would see those kids, boy, he became absolutely determined to do something about that. So it was not just politics as usual with him. He became dedicated to doing certain things and getting them done and changing things. And that was really thrilling to see. And I would go out with him on some of the campaign stops when he ran for president. I did a lot with Oregon and Northern California, and the frenzy around him, I've never seen anything like it before or since. Not with Jack Kennedy, not with anyone have I seen anything like that.
How traumatic it must have been for you to be there in Hickory Hill when all this tragedy played out, and you literally were an intimate to the extent of being in the house. It was centered with John Glenn at the time.
Yeah, no, that was horrible times. Changed all of our lives.
Mm-hmm. Back to Jackson. Last night you really had a wonderful insight. You conveyed an insight regarding the Brown versus Board. Was that the overriding? Obviously, there were many cases in the Supreme Court at the time, but was that the one that sort of was the conversation piece while you were there?
Far more than any other case while I was there. I don't mean it was the only thing we talked about, because law clerks would talk about whatever case was being argued just before and just after arguments, and there were only 18 of us at that time, and so it was wonderful. We'd have lunch together virtually every day, and we argued about whatever was current. But the one case that sort of filtered throughout the term was Brown, yes. And it was particularly interesting because we did not know what the vote was going to be. I don't think anybody did. We all assumed, certainly as Jackson did, that there would be at least one dissent and probably 3 or 4. And he thought that everybody was going to end up writing. And then, of course, Vincent's death, Frankfurter's famous comment.
His comment was,
this, for the first time, this proves to me that there is a God.
I guess it's probably stop here for a second in the sense that I think it was James Patterson wrote I'm not going to stop, but there was a quote attributed to Jackson to the extent that by 1953, Robert Jackson stated, this Vincent Court no longer respects impersonal rules of law, but is guided in these matters by personal impressions, which from time to time may be shared by the majority of the justices. You get a sense that was the atmosphere when maybe you came on and Vincent, he was still the Chief Justice.
Yeah, one of the first things I did was to go in to see the Chief Justice because he'd known my father and had been on my father's court. So.
Was that probably a fair characterization, you think?
I think so, and I think it accounts for some of the things in his unpublished opinion, that he figured that they were going to go off with no law, kind of issue an edict, and they were going to put a lot of blame on a lot of people and do things sort of by instinct rather than issuing a legal document that was supportable. I mean, don't forget now, you had these Truman appointees, and I'm a great admirer of Truman's. He appointed my father, and I very much admire so many things that he did. But in terms of Supreme Court appointments, I mean, they were hardly top flight. Vincent, Burton, Minton, and Clark. I mean, and then you had the problem, Jackson's problem, with Black and Douglas. So you put together these 4 people who were below average, and with 2 people who very much above average, but who had an agenda that was different from his. And right away you had 6 people that he considered a problem for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. I read in Kluger's book, which sort of outlines the politics of Brown versus Board, which I find fascinating. By the way, did you think Kluger's book was pretty
Yeah.
straight on?
Yeah.
When you come onto the court and you meet Vincent and you sort of look at the calendar, it's at a time where they'd already had met in conference in December of 1952 and had decided to re-argue it.
And they did not take a vote, as I understand it, at that time. So that they didn't, all they had done was talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
So that you had to, so Jackson knew the range of opinion, but he didn't know the end result, except he thought that they were probably going to overrule Plessy.
Did he have a conversation with you? Was that a kind of, Barrett, come on in, I want to talk to you a little bit, give you some thoughts, or?
He only told me what I've just told you.
Right.
I mean, he's told me that they had the conference, that they decided to put it over, that he wasn't sure, pretty sure that Reed was going to dissent, and that maybe, possibly Frankfurter even, and so forth. But he made it clear he didn't know for sure.
Right.
But he did not talk a lot about his own views. It wasn't until I got that memo
Mm-hmm.
that I really knew where he stood, where he was going. You know, I think that I've said so many times that Jackson was a practical man. I'm guessing now, but I will bet that he thought that the decisive factor was their taking the cases. That once they decided to take their cases, there was only one result. How were you going to hold in 1953 or 54 that you could still segregate solely on the basis of race?
Mm-hmm.
No way, from a purely practical standpoint. Sure, you could have done that years before, and you could continue to apply Plessy in various cases, as they had done with undergraduate and law school and so forth. But how could you take a case that squarely presents the question, is it any longer constitutional, non-discriminatory, to discriminate solely on the basis of race? And I think, I'm just guessing, I'm not trying to put words in his mouth or thoughts in his head, but I would guess that he did not think it was possible to rule any other way once they had decided to face that question.
He gives you, is it a memo form or sort of a draft opinion form, or what form did you finally see his thought processes? was a memo format. And was this a memo to be, whose eyes were these, yours? I mean,
Pardon me?
when you did this memo, and Elsie Douglas typed it up, was it for you to look at, to react?
That's when he gave it to me.
So he gave it to you to react.
Right.
You wanted your thoughts. And then you in turn reacted to that memo, 23-page memo, by a reaction. And so we have this 8-page reaction. And I just made that term up. He reads this, and he looks to you and says what?
Nothing. Because the sequence was, it was not long after that he had his heart attack and went to the hospital. And then when he was in the hospital, Warren brings him the draft of his opinion.
So then,
Now you see, in Kluger in his book says that my memo is the reason that Jackson never did anything else.
right,
But I said last night that another memo that I wrote at the time indicates that he fully intended to incidentally, John Fassett is the name of the clerk I was trying to think of yesterday, who was Reed's clerk, and I think would add a lot. What part Prettyman's memo played will never be known, but it is a fact that Jackson, having written this much on the segregation cases, wrote no more. But in fact, and that's true, he did not write anymore, but another memo that I wrote at the time indicates that he fully intended to I guess I don't have that one here.
you may have sent me to.
No, another memo that I wrote sort of to the file, so to speak, which I don't seem to have here, but said that.
This may be it here, Barrett. This was a.
Oh, yeah, that's probably it. Yeah. He was about to start reworking it when he had a heart attack in March. Mm-hmm. So it must have said something to me to indicate that he was going to rework it.
At some point, did he just verbalize these thoughts to you before he was going? Obviously, the part where he leaves the hospital and actually makes an appearance at the court. Did he tell you somewhat in advance how this was going to play out, how the vote was going to come out? When did you know?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I'm trying to remember exactly what the sequence was as to whether they had the actual vote. I don't think they would have had the vote until, well, they may have had the vote that allowed Warren to write the opinion. Mm-hmm. And then slowly the votes would have come in as to in terms of joining that opinion. And he would have been in the hospital that whole time while they were coming in. And then I'm sure that Warren kept him advised of that, and particularly when he finally convinced Reed to go along, Jackson would have learned that. And I was visiting him virtually every day, so I mean he would tell me precisely what was happening. So we knew very soon after Warren's opinion was circulated that there was a majority that was going the same way as Jackson. But we didn't know until pretty close to the end that it was going to be unanimous. And then, as you know, he left the hospital that very day. Jackson left the hospital the very day of the decision, came in through the basement and was there for the decision itself.
Do you know he was coming that day?
Yeah.
Must have been fairly dramatic otherwise to see him there.
It was very dramatic. press was astounded.
And that presumably was the tip-off that something was going to happen.
Right, but they didn't. They weren't up, and the press wasn't up in the courtroom because they were, in those days, they'd get the opinions down through a chute into the press room. So they were expecting the opinion to come down as soon as whoever was the author of it was going to start reading, and down there they could get to their phones easily and so forth. So they were down in the press room, but then, when it did not come down, that's when they all rushed upstairs to hear it.
The sense of the dramatic of it all, was that Earl Warren orchestrating that?
Sure.
And that was by design?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you know, I don't, it's not fair for me to say that I don't know that for sure, but I mean, he was a very strong and demanding person, and he was politically oriented, and I'm sure this was his idea of exactly how it should be done.
Were you in the court when they read the opinion?
Oh, yeah. Oh. And it was absolutely fascinating because there were a couple of other opinions first. And then the chief said, I have the opinion for the court in numbers, blah, blah, blah. And he started in, and when he got to the point where it was not clear at first where he was going. You couldn't tell. In fact, it went out over the AP wire that he had begun reading, but the result was not clear. And then finally, when he got to the key phrase, he inserted the word unanimously, which was not in the opinion. We unanimously hold. And the courtroom went, like a big, deep breath, which you could hear in the courtroom, because that's the one thing nobody expected.
And so the decision is rendered. The reaction among the clerks at that time, because the clerks, I assume, knew at that time that...
Well, the clerks had varying degrees of knowledge. A couple of them, I don't think, even made it to the courtroom, had not been told by the justice that it was coming down. Others had been told to be in the courtroom, but were only vaguely aware of everything that had happened. And then there were some of us, and particularly, I think, Frankfurter's clerks and myself, who had been in on the whole thing. Me, partly because that's the way Jackson treated me, but partly because his being in the hospital necessitated my being a messenger back and forth on a lot of different things. So some clerks knew more than others.
At any point during the process, did you get a sense that the justices were the clerks ever used to deliver messages to the judges? Or was it just direct, Earl Warren to Justice Jackson, or Earl Warren's clerk to you to get a message to Justice Jackson? Was that a process at all?
The reason I'm hesitating is that in those days, the justices sent messages back and forth to certain clerks from the bench. And Frankfurter would often send a message to Jackson through me. And so and also justices borrowed clerks in some instances. I did one whole thing in a big tax case. I did it for Clark, and I did some memos for Frankfurter. So I'm hesitating, but as to whether Earl Warren gave me anything to give to Jackson in the hospital, I just don't remember that. It's possible, but I just don't. I have no recollection one way or the other.
The decision's rendered, but ultimately the order was not. As I recall, that you were one of 6 clerks appointed by Chief Justice Warren to put together a report.
Well, it was different things. As I mentioned last night, Alex Bickle did the thing on the history of the 14th Amendment. and some others did some memos that I don't even remember now. My particular job was try to figure out, as a practical matter, what are we dealing with here? I mean, are we dealing with a city, for example, where blacks are all mixed in with whites, and their schools are just picked by chance? Or at the other extreme, are we dealing with places where blacks are entirely segregated within a city and have their own school right there, and whites are everywhere else, or what is the situation? So I got a group of maps, and it went around. You see all the justices signing off on it, except Jackson. There's a line through Jackson's name because he was then off the court, and Harlan had come on. They add his name at the bottom. And I have discussion of maps, and then I've got the maps of various cities, and in one case, I think it's Spartanburg, South Carolina, you could tell where the blacks and the whites lived.
And this was part of the decision basis for
No, this was part of the decree.
Decree.
Part of the decree.
Were there? I should know.
But I don't mean that the decree was in any way based on those maps. This was for informational purposes, so they would have a better idea of what it was that they were dealing with. And I think if it had any impact at all, it was simply to show them that this was not a simple matter.
No.
This was not a simple matter at all. You couldn't just have the judge order it done. That it was very, very complicated on the local level.
And Jackson knew that intuitively.
Sure.
And
Even though he emphasized time and again that he came from a place that really did not have a diversity problem. I did not think he thought of Jamestown as a place that had segregation problems.
well, very few blacks.
Yeah.
After the decision in May 17th, 1954, was there any reflection thereafter that you heard that Jackson, I don't want to say second guess, but just reflected?
No, he didn't go back, and that wasn't like him. He didn't go back and think we should have done it differently, or he was not the kind to look back very much. He was going to be interested in the decree, and of course did not live to see that. But it's interesting that the court essentially did what he said he would not be a part of, because he thought that they had to give direction to the district judges. They couldn't just let them go off and do the best they could, that it wasn't fair. As he put it, as I read last night, that they had to face their neighbors' opinions and overrule those opinions, and they had to do it on the basis of something that was told to them and not just off the top of their heads. And but that's essentially what the court did.
Barrett, this is Steve Hoden. Steve's been
Hi.
Sorry I'm late.
That's all right. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Steve's been following this for 3 years, the Jackson Center. So he's our own little Jackson Center Boswell. The you could spin Brown forever. And by the way, I hope that I will be able to convince you to see whether there might. Well, I can have a conversation with you concerning the possibility of doing something next April with the clerks who are there. And so
We can certainly talk about that.
Sure. Because this could go on forever, Brown. This guy's the most fascinating guy in the world. I was talking about Steve. Other cases, I mean, it's almost lost in the fact that during that term, and plus that you were there were other important cases. What else stood out for Prettyman?
Well, the one thing that stood out the most was what I mentioned last night, Irvine, simply because that was such a strange result in and of itself, but also because the Chief Justice joined an opinion which a short time later he never would have joined. I mean, he would have voted to reverse that case in a second after he became more acclimated to the court. But he was hesitant in the early days, and he joined Jackson in that Irvine opinion. Some of the other cases were pretty run-of-the-mill. We did some tax cases, labor case. The tax cases were interesting, if you like, tax law, because they dealt with such things as whether one state could, in effect, force another state to collect its taxes and things of that sort. We had some question of whether states could, whether the federal government could regulate purely intra-state activities.
Now, which case was that?
That was principally U.S. versus 5 gambling devices. That was a case where there was a federal statute that required those who transported gambling machines to report in detail all the sales, report to the Attorney General all the sales. But the record showed that these were not being transported in interstate commerce, the ones that they were trying to, were purely intrastate. And Jackson held for plurality of the court that the federal statute could not, which is interesting because he went very far in interpreting the power of the federal government to regulate interstate commerce. But he said here, you know, this is purely and wholly and entirely intrastate, and you can't do that. So that was interesting. And then, whereas he had he had 7 majority opinions that term, he had 8 other opinions that were either dissents or concurrences, with varying number of people going along with him. And I think one of the most interesting things there, I don't know if I have that sheet, I don't think I do, is that the people who went along with his opinions, whether they were majority opinions or dissents or concurrences, the people he got to join with him, the one who joined him most was Minton, and the one who joined him least was Black. Minton joined him 10 times, and Black joined him twice. And then it ranged all the way from Minton and Burton and so forth on down through the liberals. It's quite interesting. But in his concurrences and dissents, they dealt with the religious exemption, selective service. He dissented from a one-word reversal in a case. He said, we certainly deserve to tell the parties more than one word reverse. He voted against allowing Arkansas to file an original complaint against Texas because of the peculiar circumstances.